Hi, let's talk a little more about valved brass instruments and how they work. As you can see, this is a tuba, etc., etc., etc. Our topic today will be the creation of scales on your valved brass instrument. So today we will be dealing more with the thinking aspect, collecting some prerequisites before progressing to the knowing aspect in a later video. A scale is just a collection of notes. For example, these are the notes in my scale. These are the notes in my collection. I could also have these notes in my collection, or these notes in my collection, or these notes in my collection. Let's say I have these notes, and I'd like to invent a melody using my scale. That might sound something like this. Right? I could also invent a melody with a different scale, for example. Right? That was that scale. So again, a scale is basically any collection of notes. Now, in order to learn these scales with ease, it would be great if we could create something akin to a piano keyboard on our valved brass instruments. And in order to do that, we need to become experts in half steps and whole steps. Scales are full of half steps and whole steps, which is the reason why we need to become experts on half steps and whole steps. And for us today, this entails three things: being able to recognize them when you hear them, being able to sing them, and being able to finger them on your valved brass instrument. The first thing I need to be able to do with half steps and whole steps is to recognize them when I hear them. So team up with a friend who either plays piano or another instrument, or go to a piano yourself and close your eyes and play two neighboring white keys and test yourself. Can you hear the difference between a whole step and a half step? For example, that was a descending half step. That was an ascending whole step. I don't know what that one was. I guess I need to practice. The next thing I should be able to do is to sing a half step or a whole step from any given pitch. So for example, I want to sing an ascending whole step. Da da, and I check it. Okay, I got it right. How about this one? I want a descending half step. Da da, check it. Okay, now from this note I want, let's say, a descending whole step. Da 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 da. I guess I need to practice. Okay, the final step for today in becoming an expert on half steps and whole steps would be to know how to finger them on your instrument. We'll start with half steps, and we'll take a flugelhorn as an example. As you know, the baby, or the second valve, lowers the note by a half step. So anytime I want to change a note by a half step, the baby is probably the first valve that I'll be thinking of. For example, if I want to lower this fingering, the open fingering, by a half step, then I press the baby. If I want to lower this fingering by a half step, I press the baby. If I want to lower this fingering by a half step, then I press the baby. Or this fingering. Or if I want to raise this fingering by a half step, then I just release the baby, right? So most of the time, changing a note by a half step just means changing the baby. But sometimes the baby is already depressed. Mwah, poor baby. And if the baby is already depressed, then there is still a way to lower a note by a half step. It's just not as easy as pressing the baby. You just have to lower the note by a bit too much first, so lower the dad, or press the dad, and release the baby, right? So in the end, adding a whole step and subtracting a half step is the same thing as adding a half step. So that's the second way to change a note by a half step, is the swapping the baby and the dad. One more way would be to swap the dad and the grandfather. For example, if I have this fingering and I want to lower it, let's say, by a half step. Well, I couldn't press the baby because the baby is already down. And I couldn't swap the baby and the dad because the dad is also already down. Okay, so then I would have to lower it by quite a bit more than I want to, so the grandfather, but then subtract the dad, and I also get a half step. So, to review, 3 ways of changing a note by a half step. Pressing the baby, pressing the dad and releasing the baby, or pressing the grandfather and releasing the dad. Right? Those are for the descending intervals, and obviously for ascending it's just the reverse. Okay, so on to the whole step. As you know, the dad, or the first valve, lowers a note by 1 whole step. So if I want to change a note by a whole step, I'll be thinking about the dad first. So let's say I have an open fingering. How do I lower that by a whole step? Add the dad. What if I have this? Add the dad. What if I want to lower this note by a whole step? Again, add the dad. What if I have this note? Again, add the dad. What if I have this and I want to raise it by a whole step? Well, subtract the dad, right? So again, the dad is the first thing you'll want to think of when you think of whole steps. But what if the dad is already depressed? Well, there is a way. Let's say we have this fingering. I can't add the dad because he's already down. So, but what I could do is I could add the grandfather, which is actually a little more, right? Since that's 1.5, a little more than I want. And then I just have to release the baby. Okay? So I'm swapping the baby and the grandfather. And what if I have this fingering? In that case, I can't add the dad because he's already there. I also can't swap the baby and the grandfather because neither one of them is there. So I have to add them both, which lowers the note by 2 tones, and then release the dad simultaneously. Right? So in that case, I'm swapping the dad and the baby and grandfather. So to review, 3 ways of changing a note by a whole step. Add the dad, or swap the grandfather and the baby, or swap the dad with the grandfather and the baby. And obviously the ascending intervals are just the reverse. Okay, so what about the scales? I thought he said we were learning scales. They're on the way in the next video. We now have everything we need to know in order to create them. So start listening and singing and fingering your half steps and whole steps. And remember one thing while you're doing that: don't worry about raising a note above an open fingering or lowering a note below a 1, 2, 3 fingering. Okay, so now you know or are about to learn a little more about valved brass instruments and how they work.